Comfort rarely announces itself as a threat. It arrives as relief after effort, as silence after conflict, as permission to stop asking more of yourself. Yet, something unsettles you when ease lasts too long. The edge dulls, decisions slow, respect, especially self-respect, begins to erode quietly. Discomfort is not always damage. Sometimes it is a signal that strength is still awake. What happens when a man stops listening to it? Lesson 1. Comfort destroys men because it teaches surrender without ever using the word. A man rarely decides to abandon discipline. He simply accepts relief one time too many. End quote. The title is not a metaphor. Comfort becomes dangerous the moment it stops being recovery and starts becoming identity. You notice it in small permissions. Sleeping a little longer because yesterday was difficult. Avoiding a hard conversation because peace feels preferable. Choosing distraction because thinking requires effort. None of these choices appear catastrophic. That is precisely why they succeed. History has already tested this pattern. Decay rarely begins with chaos. It begins with ease. When effort is no longer required to survive, effort must be chosen. And most men never notice the moment they stop choosing it. They confuse calm with progress. They confuse stability with growth. Yet stability without tension quietly becomes stagnation. Comfort removes urgency. Urgency sharpens perception. Without it, decisions stretch endlessly into tomorrow. You tell yourself there is time. Time to train later. Time to pray later. Time to confront weakness later. Later becomes a permanent address. Meanwhile, something invisible weakens. Not muscle, not intelligence. Authority. The authority a man holds over himself. Observe a man who has lived too long inside comfort. He negotiates with tasks that once required no discussion. He debates waking early. He debates keeping promises. He debates finishing what he began. Energy is not absent. Direction is. Comfort replaces command with preference, and preference changes daily. Noise increases as discipline fades. Endless scrolling, constant entertainment, opinions without action. These are not accidents of modern life. They are anesthetics. They prevent the discomfort that forces evaluation. Silence becomes unbearable because silence exposes distance between who you are and who you said you would become. Comfort does not attack strength directly. It dissolves resistance gradually. You stop testing limits because nothing demands testing. You stop enduring boredom because stimulation is immediate. You stop tolerating frustration because alternatives are always available. A man surrounded by options often loses the ability to endure necessity. Consider work. When effort becomes optional, excellence disappears first. Then, reliability. Eventually, even basic competence feels heavy. Not because the man lacks ability, but because friction feels offensive. Comfort teaches him that effort is unfair. The world did not change. His tolerance did. The same erosion enters relationships. Honest conversations feel aggressive. Boundaries feel exhausting. Responsibility feels intrusive. Peace becomes avoidance. Wearing polite clothing. Yet avoided tension accumulates interest. One day, respect leaves the room without raising its voice. Comfort also reshapes perception of pain. Minor inconvenience begins to feel like suffering. Waiting becomes unbearable. Criticism becomes hostility. Physical fatigue feels dangerous rather than instructive. The nervous system adapts downward. What once strengthened now overwhelms. There is a sentence worth remembering. Comfort asks nothing and eventually receives everything. The danger is not pleasure itself. Recovery has purpose. Rest restores clarity. But when rest loses its boundary, effort becomes abnormal. Discipline begins to feel extreme. A man surrounded by ease starts perceiving strength as aggression. He calls restraint repression. He calls endurance obsession. Words adjust themselves to protect inertia. You may recognize the moment quietly. Tasks postponed. Promises softened. Standards negotiated internally before anyone else hears them. No collapse occurs. Only a slow lowering of expectations until mediocrity feels reasonable. And reasonableness is difficult to argue with because it sounds mature. Comfort never demands loyalty. It simply waits. Lesson 2. Comfort destroys men because it changes how time is experienced. Under pressure, hours carry weight. Decisions matter because consequences arrive quickly. Effort produces visible movement. Remove pressure, and time expands into something shapeless. Days begin to resemble one another. Nothing feels urgent enough to demand action, yet nothing feels satisfying enough to justify rest. A man does not notice the loss immediately. He only senses a quiet restlessness he cannot explain. When comfort becomes constant, tomorrow appears endlessly available. You postpone difficult work because there is no visible penalty for delay. You assume motivation will return when needed. But motivation does not obey convenience. It responds to necessity. Without necessity, intention weakens. Plans remain clean inside notebooks, while reality remains untouched. Time has proven this pattern. The body adapts to what is repeatedly permitted. Wake without purpose long enough, and waking early begins to feel unnatural. Avoid confrontation long enough, and honesty feels cruel. Skip effort long enough, and effort feels excessive. Comfort does not remove capability. It removes familiarity with strain, and unfamiliar strain feels threatening even when it is required. Consider how easily evenings disappear. One video becomes another. One distraction replaces the previous one before silence has a chance to arrive. Nothing dramatic occurs. No obvious failure. Yet the accumulation is silent theft. Hours once used to build strength, skill, or clarity dissolve into consumption. A man tells himself he deserves relaxation. Often he does. The danger begins when relaxation becomes the only reward he seeks. Comfort teaches the mind to expect emotional neutrality at all times. Any tension becomes a problem to eliminate rather than a signal to interpret. Boredom is medicated with stimulation. Anxiety is avoided rather than examined. Fatigue becomes justification instead of information. Slowly, resilience shrinks because it is never exercised. Notice how decision-making changes. Hard choices require temporary discomfort. Saying no risks conflict. Training requires fatigue. Learning demands frustration. If comfort becomes the primary standard, decisions start revolving around minimizing disturbance rather than pursuing truth. Life becomes organized around avoiding inconvenience. Progress cannot survive inside that structure. Relationships reveal this erosion clearly. Difficult conversations are delayed because harmony feels safer. Boundaries soften because disagreement feels heavy. Over time, respect fades, not through hostility, but through absence of firmness. Comfort prefers quiet rooms, even when honesty is required to keep them standing. There is a sentence worth holding. Time unused does not remain neutral. It quietly chooses for you. A man addicted to comfort often insists he is waiting for the right moment. Better conditions, more energy, greater certainty. Yet, conditions rarely become perfect without effort first. Waiting becomes a refined form of escape, socially acceptable, because patience sounds wise. But patience without action slowly becomes permission to remain unchanged. Eventually, he notices something unsettling. Years have passed without visible collapse, yet also without meaningful construction. Nothing broke. Nothing grew. The calendar moved forward, while intention stayed behind. And the most dangerous realization arrives without drama. Comfort did not steal his life violently. It asked him to sit down and simply stop standing up. Lesson 3. Comfort destroys men because it rewrites the meaning of effort. What once felt normal begins to feel excessive. Rising early appears unnecessary. Comfort. Training the body seems obsessive. Speaking directly feels harsh. Standards that once protected dignity begin to look extreme when surrounded by ease. The man does not abandon discipline openly. He slowly redefines it as something only rigid people require. This shift rarely begins with laziness. It begins with rationalization. You worked hard yesterday. You endured enough already. You deserve softness. Each statement carries partial truth. Recovery is necessary. Mercy toward oneself has value, but comfort uses truth selectively. It removes context. Recovery without return becomes retreat. Mercy without accountability becomes indulgence. History has already tested this pattern. Civilizations did not weaken because hardship vanished overnight. They weakened when hardship stopped being respected. When convenience replaced preparation, resilience faded quietly. The same occurs inside an individual life. A man who stops practicing effort eventually loses familiarity with resistance. And unfamiliar resistance feels unfair. Observe how language changes first. I don't feel like it. It's not that serious. I'll start next week. These phrases sound harmless because they protect emotional stability. Yet stability built on avoidance becomes fragile. The smallest demand begins to feel intrusive. Minor inconvenience feels disproportionate. Effort becomes negotiation instead of instinct. Comfort also alters perception of competence. When effort decreases, results decline slowly. Instead of confronting decline, comparison lowers. You measure yourself against easier standards. Average becomes acceptable because excellence requires discomfort. The mind adapts downward to protect peace. Peace gained this way carries a hidden cost. Self-respect notices the compromise, even when words refuse to admit it. Consider physical training. The first missed session feels reasonable. The second feels understandable. Soon, the idea of returning feels heavier than continuing absence. The body loses strength gradually, but something else fades faster. Trust in your own word. You promised yourself consistency. Comfort convinces you promises are flexible. A man who negotiates with himself eventually stops believing himself. Work follows the same path. Tasks once completed immediately begin waiting for motivation. Creativity slows because friction is avoided. Excellence requires repetition through boredom. Comfort interprets boredom as a sign to stop, yet boredom is often the doorway to mastery. Leave the doorway closed long enough, and skill stagnates without protest. There is a sentence worth remembering. Effort feels heavy only to the unpracticed. Comfort also interferes with moral courage. Saying difficult truths risks rejection. Holding boundaries risks loneliness. Accepting responsibility risks failure. Ease whispers that harmony matters more than integrity. Many men choose silence not because they lack conviction, but because disturbance feels intolerable. Over time, silence reshapes identity. You begin to wonder where your former certainty went. The danger is subtle, because life may still function externally. Bills paid, conversations polite, days predictable. Nothing appears broken from the outside. Yet internally, friction disappears, and friction is where character sharpens itself. Without resistance, intention dulls. Without tension, purpose loses definition. One morning you recognize hesitation where decisiveness once lived. You hesitate before effort, before honesty, before challenge, too. End quote. End quote. Not because you cannot act, but because comfort has convinced you that action requires justification. And justification is endless when the standard becomes feeling rather than necessity. Lesson 4. Comfort destroys men because it removes friction from responsibility. Friction is rarely pleasant. It interrupts preference. It demands attention when distraction feels easier. Yet friction is what forces alignment between intention and action. Without it, responsibility becomes negotiable. A man begins to treat obligations as suggestions rather than commitments, not through rebellion, but through softness. The title speaks directly to this erosion. Comfort does not merely slow progress. It changes the relationship between a man and what he owes. Work owed to his craft, presence owed to his family, truth owed to himself. When ease becomes constant, duty begins to feel intrusive. Responsibility starts sounding like pressure imposed by others rather than structure chosen for dignity. Time has proven that pressure clarifies hierarchy. When circumstances demand effort, priorities reveal themselves quickly. You do what must be done because delay carries consequence. Remove consequence long enough and priorities blur. Everything feels equally optional. Important tasks compete with trivial pleasures and often lose because pleasure asks less. Consider how avoidance develops. An unanswered message, a postponed decision, a conversation delayed because conflict feels unnecessary. Each delay reduces immediate discomfort. The relief feels intelligent, efficient, even. Yet avoidance accumulates weight invisibly. Problems grow quietly, while the man enjoys temporary calm. Eventually, what required courage becomes crisis. Comfort encourages emotional diplomacy with reality. You soften truths internally before speaking them aloud. You adjust expectations downward to prevent disappointment. You tell yourself circumstances are complicated. Often they are. Complexity becomes convenient shelter when action feels demanding. Responsibility requires clarity. Comfort prefers ambiguity. Observe leadership in ordinary environments. The man who avoids difficult correction at work preserves short-term harmony. Employees remain comfortable. Conversations stay polite. But standards weaken. Reliability declines. Authority fades without confrontation ever occurring. Leadership does not collapse through hostility. It dissolves through tolerance of what should have been addressed early. Relationships follow the same pattern. Honest disagreement risks tension. Boundaries risk misunderstanding. Comfort persuades a man to keep peace by withholding firmness. Silence appears kind in the moment. Over time, resentment grows quietly beneath politeness. Respect notices hesitation long before words admit it. People trust steadiness, not accommodation disguised as gentleness. There is a sentence worth holding. Responsibility delayed becomes authority surrendered. Comfort also alters the perception of fatigue. Necessary exhaustion begins to feel avoidable. A man starts organizing life around conserving energy instead of investing it. He protects himself from strain rather than preparing himself to endure it. Yet, endurance cannot develop without exposure. Muscles strengthen through resistance. Judgment strengthens through consequence. Character strengthens through obligation fulfilled when enthusiasm is absent. Modern life amplifies this danger. Convenience eliminates waiting. Services eliminate effort. Technology eliminates boredom. These tools carry usefulness, but they quietly remove encounters with resistance. Without resistance, patience weakens. Without patience, responsibility feels aggressive. A man surrounded by solutions begins to lose tolerance for problems. The tragedy is not immediate failure. Often, life continues functioning. Income arrives. Conversations remain cordial. No dramatic collapse announces the change. Yet, internally, a shift occurs. You begin asking what you feel like doing instead of what must be done. The question sounds harmless. It slowly replaces discipline with preference. One day, obligation arrives without warning. Crisis, loss, unexpected demand. Suddenly, effort is required again. And the man discovers something unsettling. The muscles of responsibility, once strong enough to carry weight without complaint, now hesitate under pressure they once considered ordinary. Lesson 5. Comfort destroys men because it separates pleasure from effort. When reward arrives without struggle, meaning begins to thin. The mind adapts quickly to satisfaction that costs nothing. Food delivered instantly, entertainment without pause, attention granted without achievement. None of these appear harmful alone. The danger emerges when pleasure stops being the result of discipline and becomes the substitute for it. A man does not lose ambition overnight. He simply begins receiving emotional rewards without earning structural progress. Validation through images instead of competence. Excitement through novelty instead of mastery. Approval through appearance rather than reliability. The nervous system learns a dangerous lesson. Satisfaction can be obtained without endurance. Once learned, effort feels inefficient. History has already tested this pattern. When reward becomes detached from contribution, standards collapse quietly. Work feels heavier because pleasure feels lighter. The mind compares discomfort against immediate gratification and chooses relief repeatedly. Over time, motivation does not disappear. It redirects toward what is easiest to obtain. Observe how easily evenings become consumption instead of construction. A man sits down, intending to rest briefly. Rest becomes escape. Escape becomes habit. Habit becomes expectation. Nothing dramatic occurs. Tomorrow still arrives. Responsibilities still exist. Yet, energy required to confront them weakens because pleasure has already simulated accomplishment. Comfort reshapes dopamine into a currency spent without awareness. Small bursts of stimulation replace deep satisfaction earned through completion. You check notifications instead of finishing work. You search for distraction during boredom instead of passing through it. Boredom once served as a signal to create or improve. Comfort interprets boredom as a malfunction requiring entertainment. Consider physical desire as well. Pleasure without restraint dulls focus. Appetite expands, while tolerance for denial shrinks. Discipline requires saying no repeatedly, often without applause. Comfort convinces a man denial is unnecessary. Why refuse what feels good? Yet refusal trains command over impulse. Without command, impulse quietly becomes leadership. Relationships also suffer under effortless pleasure. Attention becomes fragmented. Presence weakens. Conversations shorten because stimulation elsewhere promises faster reward. Genuine connection demands patience, listening, discomfort at times. Comfort encourages emotional shortcuts. Eventually, intimacy feels exhausting because it cannot compete with convenience. There is a sentence worth remembering. Pleasure earned strengthens. Pleasure granted weakens. Work reveals the same erosion. Projects requiring months lose appeal against distractions, offering instant emotional return. Craftsmanship fades because repetition feels slow. Excellence requires tolerance for monotony. Comfort teaches avoidance of monotony at all costs. A man begins many things and completes few. Completion requires endurance after excitement fades. Even faith becomes vulnerable. Reflection requires silence. Prayer requires stillness. Self-examination requires discomfort. Endless stimulation leaves no space for confrontation with oneself. A man may remain surrounded by spiritual language while avoiding spiritual discipline entirely. Noise replaces conviction because silence demands honesty. The tragedy is subtle. Life may appear enjoyable. Laughter exists. Entertainment fills hours. Yet beneath pleasure rests an unease difficult to name. Satisfaction feels temporary. Achievements feel smaller. Confidence becomes fragile because it rests on experience rather than effort. Eventually, something changes inside perception. Hard work begins to feel unfair. Sacrifice begins to feel outdated. Endurance begins to look unnecessary. Not because the world removed struggle, but because comfort trained the mind to expect reward without first accepting weight. Lesson 6. Comfort destroys men because it weakens tolerance for uncertainty. A man grows through encounters he cannot fully control, decisions made without guarantees, risks taken without applause. Movement forward despite incomplete clarity. Comfort replaces exposure with predictability. Predictability feels safe. Over time, it becomes confinement disguised as stability. The title does not accuse rest. Rest restores judgment. But permanent ease teaches the mind to avoid unknown outcomes. You begin choosing only what carries minimal emotional risk. Conversations remain shallow because honesty may disturb peace. Opportunities remain untouched because failure might embarrass you. The future becomes something to manage carefully rather than something to confront directly. Time has proven this pattern repeatedly. Courage rarely disappears through fear alone. It fades through excessive certainty. When environments eliminate unpredictability, adaptability weakens. A man becomes efficient inside routines but fragile outside them. Remove the familiar structure and hesitation appears immediately. Consider how decisions change under comfort. You research endlessly before acting. You wait for confidence before commitment. You search for reassurance before responsibility. Preparation feels intelligent. Often it is. Yet preparation without exposure quietly becomes avoidance. Life does not offer guarantees proportional to preparation. Eventually, action must precede certainty. Uncertainty carries discomfort because it reveals limitation. You may fail publicly. You may be misunderstood. You may discover incompetence where confidence once lived. Comfort persuades you these risks are unnecessary. Why disturb peace when safety exists? Yet safety maintained through avoidance narrows experience until growth becomes accidental rather than chosen. Work illustrates this erosion clearly. A man remains in familiar roles long after challenge disappears. Income continues. Competence remains unquestioned, yet curiosity fades. Innovation requires tolerance for mistakes. Comfort discourages mistakes because mistakes disturb identity. Slowly, stagnation replaces mastery, while appearances remain respectable. Relationships also reveal fear of uncertainty. Honest vulnerability risks rejection. Clear boundaries risk separation. Many men choose emotional neutrality instead. They maintain pleasant interactions while avoiding depth. Depth requires unpredictability. Another person may disagree, may leave, may expose weakness. Comfort interprets these possibilities as threats rather than necessary encounters. There is a sentence worth holding. Certainty feels safe until it becomes small. Even personal growth becomes filtered through comfort. You choose challenges already aligned with existing strengths. Training feels productive because success is likely. Real transformation demands confronting incompetence deliberately. The beginner's position feels humiliating to a comfortable identity. So, the man avoids arenas where learning would reshape him. Modern environments intensify this temptation. Algorithms predict preference. Services anticipate need. Navigation eliminates getting lost. Efficiency increases, while resilience decreases. Small inconveniences once trained patience and improvisation. Now frustration appears quickly because expectation of smoothness dominates experience. Faith encounters the same danger. Trust requires stepping forward without visible outcome. Comfort encourages control instead. You seek certainty before obedience. You wait for emotional assurance before conviction. Silence feels uncomfortable because answers do not arrive immediately. Yet silence has always been where endurance learns to listen. The tragedy is not fear itself. Fear can sharpen awareness. The tragedy is shrinking the world until fear never needs to be faced. One day disruption arrives uninvited. Loss, change, responsibility beyond preparation. And the man realizes uncertainty was never the enemy. Avoiding it was. Lesson 7. Comfort destroys men because it dissolves authority from within long before anyone else notices. Authority is not volume. It is not dominance. It is the quiet certainty that when a decision is made, action follows. That certainty is built through repetition of difficult choices, kept without negotiation. Comfort interrupts that repetition. It introduces hesitation between intention and execution. The danger is subtle. A man still speaks confidently. He still plans. He still imagines the person he intends to become. Yet promises made to himself begin to soften. Wake early tomorrow. Train after work. Finish the task tonight. Each delay feels justified. Fatigue, timing, mood. None of these explanations sound dishonest. Over time, they produce something more damaging than failure. They produce doubt. History has already tested this pattern. Armies did not lose discipline because orders disappeared. They lost discipline when enforcement weakened internally. The same occurs within a man. Self-command fades when obedience to personal standards becomes optional. You begin negotiating with impulses that once received immediate refusal. Observe how hesitation grows. You think longer before acting, not out of wisdom, but reluctance. Effort requires discussion. Responsibility requires emotional preparation. Even small commitments carry invisible resistance. The body remains capable. The mind remains intelligent. Yet something between decision and movement slows down. Comfort teaches the nervous system to avoid internal conflict. Discipline requires conflict. One part of you wants ease. Another demands growth. Authority emerges when growth wins consistently. Comfort persuades you compromise is maturity. Balance, it whispers. Sometimes, balance is wisdom. Often, it becomes an elegant excuse for lowering standards gradually. Consider reputation. Others may still respect you. Success from past effort may carry forward, but self-respect depends on private observation. And consider. You know when you avoided effort unnecessarily. You know when honesty was postponed. You know when distraction replaced responsibility. Authority erodes quietly because the witness inside you never forgets. There is a sentence worth remembering. A man who doubts his own word cannot stand firmly in any room. Relationships reveal this erosion immediately. Boundaries weaken because enforcing them feels uncomfortable. Requests you should refuse. Receive hesitant acceptance. Conflict avoidance replaces clarity. Others sense uncertainty even when they cannot explain it. Authority does not disappear loudly. It leaks through inconsistency. Work exposes the same pattern. Deadlines extend. Excellence becomes negotiable. Leadership hesitates to correct errors because confrontation feels heavy. Soon standards drift downward without announcement. The environment adapts to lowered expectation. Comfort spreads outward through tolerance. Modern distraction amplifies the problem. Endless stimulation fragments attention. Attention fragmented weakens commitment. You begin many actions without finishing them. Completion builds authority because it proves endurance beyond excitement. Comfort prefers beginnings. Beginnings feel hopeful without demanding perseverance. Even solitude changes under comfort. Silence once offered examination. Now it feels threatening because unfinished intentions appear clearly there. Noise becomes refuge. Music always playing. Screens always active. Without silence, authority cannot rebuild because authority requires honest inventory. One morning, a realization arrives without drama. You hesitate before tasks you once executed without thought. You search for motivation where discipline once stood automatically. Nothing external forced this change. Comfort simply waited until obedience to yourself felt negotiable. Lesson 8. Comfort destroys men because it teaches them to misinterpret pain. Pain once served as orientation. Fatigue revealed effort. Failure revealed direction. Loneliness revealed misalignment. Discomfort functioned as information. Comfort reframes every form of tension as something abnormal, something to escape immediately. A man begins treating signals as threats instead of messages. The title does not glorify suffering. Injury weakens. Chaos exhausts. Meaningless hardship hardens without wisdom. But the absence of friction removes correction. Without resistance, you cannot measure strength. Without challenge, you cannot locate weakness. Comfort removes contrast. Life feels smooth, while direction quietly disappears. Time has proven that growth rarely arrives politely. Skill demands repetition beyond enthusiasm. Character demands restraint when reaction feels easier. Faith demands patience when answers remain silent. Pain accompanies each process because transformation requires displacement of habit. Comfort persuades you displacement is unnecessary. Improvement becomes theoretical rather than lived. Observe how quickly modern environments respond to discomfort. Boredom is filled instantly. Hunger is answered immediately. Loneliness is distracted rather than confronted. Even sadness is often rushed toward elimination. Relief appears compassionate. Sometimes it is. Yet constant relief prevents examination. If every unpleasant sensation disappears quickly, you never learn why it arrived. Consider physical training. Muscle strengthens through controlled damage followed by recovery. Remove strain entirely, and deterioration begins despite good intention. The same law governs discipline. Emotional endurance develops through tolerated frustration. Intellectual clarity develops through confusion, endured long enough to understand. Comfort interrupts both processes at the first sign of difficulty. Work offers clear examples. A challenging project produces uncertainty. Doubt appears. Mistakes occur. Pain signals learning in progress. Comfort interprets these signals as evidence you chose incorrectly. You abandon the effort prematurely. Later, you search again for passion, unaware that mastery was waiting beyond the discomfort you escaped. Relationships suffer under this misunderstanding as well. Honest conversations feel tense. Vulnerability exposes insecurity. Conflict reveals incompatibility or necessary change. Comfort encourages withdrawal instead. Distance feels peaceful at first, yet avoidance leaves misunderstandings untouched. Pain postponed returns heavier because truth waited unattended. There is a sentence worth holding. Pain ignored becomes confusion prolonged. Even identity becomes unstable without discomfort. Feedback feels hostile because criticism unsettles ease. Correction feels insulting because effort has not recently been tested. A man surrounded by comfort may begin protecting self-image more than pursuing truth. Fragility grows quietly beneath politeness. Modern convenience amplifies the confusion. Temperature controlled, effort minimized, waiting eliminated. These advancements carry benefit, yet they remove encounters with patience and endurance that once shaped resilience naturally. Small inconveniences begin to feel disproportionate because tolerance has narrowed. Faith encounters the same distortion. Silence during prayer feels like abandonment when comfort expects immediate reassurance. Doubt feels unacceptable rather than instructive. Yet endurance inside unanswered moments has always refined conviction. Comfort demands clarity before obedience. Growth often requires obedience before clarity. Eventually, reality introduces unavoidable pain, loss, failure, responsibility beyond preference. The man discovers he no longer recognizes discomfort as guidance. Every signal feels overwhelming because interpretation was never practiced. Pain did not suddenly increase. Familiarity with it quietly disappeared. Lesson 9. Comfort destroys men because it removes their ability to stand alone with themselves. Solitude once functioned as a forge. A man entered silence and encountered truth without interruption. Thoughts clarified, motives revealed themselves, weakness lost, disguise because distraction was absent. Comfort replaces solitude with constant occupation. Noise becomes permanent company. The danger does not appear dramatic. Music fills empty rooms. Messages arrive continuously. Screens remain within reach at every pause. Nothing seems harmful. Conversation exists. Entertainment exists. Information flows endlessly. Yet something essential disappears when silence is never allowed to settle. Self-confrontation requires stillness. Without stillness, illusion survives comfortably. History has already tested this pattern. Leaders capable of decisive action were rarely those surrounded by constant approval. They spent time alone long enough to separate impulse from judgment. Solitude forces evaluation because no audience remains to impress. Comfort persuades a man evaluation is unnecessary. Validation replaces examination. Observe what happens when quiet arrives unexpectedly. Waiting in a car without music. Walking without headphones. Sitting alone after work. Restlessness appears quickly. The mind searches for interruption. Thoughts surface that feel inconvenient. Questions about direction, about integrity, about unfinished responsibilities. Comfort teaches escape at this moment. Reach for distraction. Scroll. Fill the space. Yet boredom once served a purpose. Boredom invited creation, reflection, planning. Many decisions that shaped lives emerged during unoccupied moments. Remove boredom entirely, and imagination weakens. Creativity requires tolerance for emptiness before insight arrives. Comfort eliminates the waiting period where ideas mature. Consider relationships. A man uncomfortable alone often seeks company to avoid himself rather than to know another person. Conversation becomes performance instead of presence. Dependence grows quietly because solitude feels threatening. Genuine connection requires two individuals capable of standing independently. Comfort encourages emotional crowding instead. Work suffers similarly. Deep focus demands extended silence. Complex problems resist quick solutions. Comfort interrupts concentration through constant novelty. Notifications fracture attention. Multitasking replaces immersion. Output continues, but depth fades. A man begins many tasks without entering the state where mastery forms. There is a sentence worth remembering. Silence does not accuse, it reveals. Faith depends on this principle as well. Reflection requires waiting without immediate response. Prayer often feels unanswered because answers require listening longer than comfort allows. Noise fills spiritual space quickly. Words remain while attention disappears. Conviction weakens when inner dialogue never slows enough to hear correction. Comfort also protects ego from confrontation. Alone in silence, excuses sound thin. Promises postponed become visible. Compromises appear clearly. Without solitude, these realizations remain buried beneath activity. Activity feels productive, even when direction is absent. Modern life celebrates connection, yet quietly fears aloneness. Constant communication appears like strength, yet a man unable to endure his own company often struggles to endure adversity. Crisis removes distractions suddenly. In those moments, silence returns without invitation. And when it does, the question waiting there is rarely gentle. Not what others expect of you, not what circumstances demanded. Only what you avoided asking while comfort kept the room full. Lesson 10. Comfort destroys men because it convinces them that hardship is an enemy rather than a teacher. A man begins organizing his life around avoidance, avoiding fatigue, avoiding rejection, avoiding uncertainty, avoiding responsibility that stretches beyond preference. The intention appears reasonable. Who willingly chooses difficulty? Yet the absence of chosen hardship guarantees the arrival of unchosen hardship later. The title carries weight because comfort does not merely weaken endurance, it removes preparation. When effort is avoided consistently, resilience never develops proportionally. Life eventually demands strength without warning. Illness arrives. Loss interrupts routine. Responsibility expands suddenly. A man trained only in ease discovers he must now learn endurance under pressure instead of before it. Time has proven this pattern repeatedly. Those capable of standing firm during crisis were rarely those who searched for suffering. They simply refused to escape necessary discomfort earlier. Discipline practiced quietly became protection later. Not because hardship was romanticized, but because it was understood as instruction. Consider deliberate effort, rising early when sleep invites negotiation, training when fatigue argues convincingly, speaking truth when silence promises comfort. None of these acts feel heroic in the moment. They often feel inconvenient. Yet, inconvenience builds familiarity with resistance. Familiar resistance becomes calm under pressure. Modern environments encourage the opposite instinct. Efficiency removes waiting. Convenience removes labor. Comfort removes exposure to limits. These advances provide undeniable benefit, yet they quietly remove opportunities to practice endurance voluntarily. A man begins believing difficulty signals error rather than growth. Work reveals the consequence clearly. When challenge appears, many search immediately for escape instead of adaptation. Changing direction becomes easier than improving capacity. Projects abandoned accumulate quietly behind new beginnings. Identity becomes tied to potential rather than completion. Comfort prefers possibility because possibility carries no weight. Relationships demand hardship as well. Loyalty requires patience during misunderstanding. Commitment requires endurance when emotion fades temporarily. Honesty requires courage when truth risks distance. Comfort encourages departure at the first sustained discomfort. Peace becomes temporary because depth was never allowed to form through endurance. There is a sentence worth holding. Hardship chosen teaches obedience before hardship imposed demands it. Faith has always understood this tension. Waiting without visible reward sharpens trust. Serving without recognition refines motive. Forgiveness without apology stretches humility. Comfort asks, why endure what feels heavy? Conviction answers, because weight reveals strength previously unseen. Deliberate hardship does not mean seeking misery. It means refusing escape when growth requires friction. Walking instead of always riding. Finishing instead of abandoning. Listening instead of reacting. Remaining when leaving would feel easier. Small decisions accumulate into quiet authority over circumstance. Eventually, something changes internally. Discomfort loses its threat. Fatigue becomes familiar rather than alarming. Silence becomes useful rather than empty. Responsibility feels natural instead of intrusive. The man realizes hardship did not diminish him, it clarified him. And in that clarity, comfort finally loses its disguise, not as rest, not as peace, but as the patient voice that once asked him to sit down long enough to forget what standing required. If this message met you at the right moment, do not let it pass unnoticed. Reflection without action becomes another form of comfort. Subscribe to Austere Mind if you are willing to confront what most prefer to avoid, not for motivation, not for noise, for clarity. Leave a comment with the lesson that unsettled you the most. Discipline begins where honesty replaces performance. And if you know a man who has been slowly negotiating with comfort, share this with him. Some warnings arrive quietly. The ones worth hearing usually do.